Okay, so we're going to talk about the Penta. And the Penta is an idea that Tom Gilb and I came up with about a year and a half ago. I was expressing upset over the fact that everybody talks about scope, time, cost fixed, and quality goes down. And I'm saying, well, that's not how I work, and it's not true. You can't make a theory that says this is the way it always is when there are billion-dollar companies proving it's false, like Toyota, like other companies. There are many, many companies that have proven this false. And if you recognize that, then you might look at, well, what did they do? Now, people will say, oh, yeah, but Toyota didn't. You can't copy Lean. Okay, don't copy Lean. That's right. You can't copy Lean. That doesn't work. And in fact, that's why Lean has not been successful. But that doesn't mean it can't be done. So that was the inspiration. And Tom has since written a little booklet on it, on the Penta, which is about how to actually use it. This talk is not going to go over that. I will add a link to that in the notes. This is to express the idea of the Penta, because if we can stop believing the iron triangle and really realize that it's a very limiting view that gets us looking in the wrong way, the Penta opens up a whole bunch of possibilities. And in fact, it leads to the insights of what I call requirements by objectives, which is another topic completely that I'm writing up, which is we don't want to come from scope, we want to come from the objectives. And we'll talk about this as we get through it. People have talked about go from output to outcome, and that's half the way to where we need to be. And I'll talk about that a little bit. Penta opens this up. So let's start with a couple of things. This is a very critical insight. This is perhaps the most important insight I know. We don't think and talk about what we see. We only see what we're able to think and talk about, which means if we're not talking about it, we're not going to see it, even if it's obvious. Now, you've all had this experience. Have you ever talked to somebody and you're just totally blocked with something you know is not that difficult? And then they say something. They say something, and now you are thinking and talking about it, or at least you're listening. And now you can see it. And you say, aha, it's not a new insight. It's something you already knew, but you didn't remember that you knew it. Or maybe you didn't know you knew it, but you knew it. So this is really important. We are we're looking here under the lamppost where the light's better. You know, it's like the guy who's had too much to drink and he's under the lamppost looking for his keys, wandering around, and a policeman sees him, and he sees obviously this guy's got some troubles, and he says, "Hey, can I help you, sir?" And the man says, "Hey, officer," and now the policeman realizes he's kind of had too much to drink. So the policeman asks, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, I'm looking for my keys." So the officer decides he better help him find the keys, take the keys, so he doesn't have to arrest him for drunk driving and all that. So they look for 5, 10 minutes. They can't find the keys. And the policeman finally says, "Are you sure you dropped them here?" He says, "No, I dropped them over there in the alley." Then why are we looking here? Light's better. That's how we run. And this is what's frustrating for me at times because we're very stuck on this. And what we need to see is what's out here. The iron triangle looks here. We want to go out here. The key is if it's not in our vernacular, in other words, if we're not, sorry about using a 4-letter word, I mean a 4-syllable word, but it is kind of common. If we're not in our speaking, if it's not how we talk, it's not in our sight. This is very important to recognize. And what happens because of this is we tend to go simplistic or overly complicated. We don't hit the sweet spot. It's like we tolerate poor models because that's easier than having to create better ones because that would put our ass on the line. That would put us in charge. That would have us be leading. And that's scary. And it's scary because we identify with our ego, and our ego likes to be right. And thinking for yourselves, hey, you don't always think right. You know, so this is kind of a fear-based thing. Yeah, it is. It's the devil I know. And we get so used to it, we tolerate it. This is what I talk about, how Agile has taught us a lot of learned helplessness, but I'm not going to go into that today. So I want to think about these two things, complexity and the iron triangle, because this was the thing I was telling Susan before the talk, that I had this come to me about complexity, about how we made it more complicated than it needs to be. And I've written about this a lot, probably 20 posts over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And it seemed like a distraction, but I decided to go with it. And I realized, no, it's really the part of this thing. See, I love this quote from Eliyahu Goldratt from The Choice, one of my top 3 books to read. It and The Obstacle is the Way keep alternating between 1 and 2, and Chris Alexander's Timeless Way of Building is 3, and Don Reinertson's Principles of Product Development Flow is 4. All 4 are brilliant books, so you won't hurt yourself reading any of them. But the first and most profound obstacle is that people believe that reality is complex, and therefore they are looking for sophisticated explanations for complicated solutions. Do you understand how devastating this is? Now, he's not talking so much about the world and all that. He's talking about in business, but he actually is talking about the world to some level. And he acknowledges the world's complex, but it's like there are some key things underneath it all that if you look at, and this is his opening line for this thing he calls inherent simplicity, that is one of the bases of Amplio, which is how do you get to the core few things to look at that govern the whole system. That's what he means by inherent simplicity. But we don't recognize that there is this core. We make it more complicated. You know, complexity is not as bad as it looks. Yeah, there are things we don't see. Yeah, duh. But the iron triangle is simplistic. And I'm not going to go into complexity too much, but I will mention it a little bit. There are things we don't see. The thing is, there's always complexity in knowledge work. If you've not done it before, there's some complexity there. How much isn't so much the issue, because the way you want to deal with the complexity is getting feedback so you can see things that happen that you didn't know happened, and you want to get it to not have a big impact. See, complexity is not bad if all it does is make a minor adjustment to what you need to do. It's when it makes a big adjustment to what you need to do. That's what's called a nonlinear event, when some little thing happens that causes a big thing to happen. That's what's really damaging. So I'll show a little bit. The reason I'm mentioning complexity here is because I want it to be clear that there are things we can do that we know we can do that make a difference. And a lot of people seem to think that's not possible, but it is possible. And the iron triangle is simplistic. So these are just 2 examples of too complex and simplistic. Too complex, more complicated than it needs to be, more simplistic than it needs to be. The iron triangle is one of these. So what is the iron triangle? Now, actually, I know this came out of a political view years before it wanted to into project management. So I mean, when I say the iron triangle, I mean iron triangle in project management. Okay. It's based on assumptions that the quality of work is constrained by budget, deadline, scope, and project manager can trade between the constraints, and that change in one constraint necessitates changes in others to compensate, or quality will suffer. So if you increase scope, you got to increase your budget or schedule, or your quality is going to suffer. It puts quality at a secondary thing. There's this assumption that if you fix all 3, quality must suffer. This is false. This is not true. Doesn't get challenged a lot. Well, when you challenge people, they'll say, yeah, I know, but then they come from thinking it. You know, we've talked about de jure and de facto. De jure means what it is, like as described in the law, and de facto is what happens. So when you corner people on it, they'll say, oh yeah, I don't really believe it. But then when you look at how they think, they act like they believe it. Okay. I don't know if there's a word for that, but de jure de facto seems to work okay. Now, how do I know the iron triangle is false? Because Toyota broke it. They're a great example. So now I know at least Toyota knows how to break it. Maybe you don't know. Maybe I don't know. Maybe my approach is wrong. I'll accept that. But here you have definitive proof the iron triangle does not exist. And the way they did it is interesting. prior to Toyota, mass production was considered the best way to produce goods. It's also kind of interesting how Toyota broke it, which was, well, they had smart people, but it's a historically interesting thing that they had almost no choice but to do the things that led to it being broken. They had to run in small batches. They couldn't compete against the United States after World War II. So in mass production, you ran equipment at full speed, maximizing each step to maximize the output, number of cars. They couldn't sell against the US in number of cars. They had to specialize. They had to go to small batches of special cars, special vans, special delivery type thing. The problem with that is in manufacturing, this way you get testing what happened at the end of the manufacturing line. So this is one of the problems. You can see, by the way, how manufacturing this way and waterfall are kind of similar. You do maximum focus on requirements and analysis, and then development, and then tests at the end, and you're maximizing the use of your teams. It's all about not the productivity, but the utilization of people. So there's this parallel here in mass production. And Toyota actually discovered, because they had to, as I mentioned, run small batches, that when you got quicker feedback, you detected errors quickly and you stopped having waste. And it's interesting, manufacturing and software development and product development are different, but there are amazing parallels between this. I think I at first kind of got that they're really a lot different, but a cousin of mine used to run he's retired now, but he used to run a textile mill, and he was a lean expert. Oh, we would go out on vacation to visit him and his wife, and my wife and his wife would talk all the time and about social stuff, personal stuff. He and I were talking about lean 24/7. It was so much fun. And we had this ongoing argument that I think he was right, but I don't think I ever accepted it. Was that all the stuff I was saying was so critical in software development was just as critical in hardware. And it sort of was. I mean, I knew the principles were the same, but he talked about small errors and things like that. That errors got in software, when you make an error, kind of expands over time. And he said the same thing is true in manufacturing. Of course, it expands in a different way. It's because you keep making the error over and over again that represents your broken in process work. But anyway, small batches enable quicker feedback, which in turn you find detected errors. Managing work in process lowered wait times and quickened feedback. These were key insights. You know, the system caused most of the errors. So when an error occurred, it was important to fix the system immediately. Now this is a very, very important idea. This is one of the biggest differences between lean or the Toyota production system and Agile today. Agile today uses, a lot of people in Agile today use what's called inspect and adapt. Something happens, we see what happened, we adapt, we fix it. That sounds reasonable. Problem comes up, fix it. Problem comes up, fix it. Problem comes up, fix it. I should be doing this. Problem comes up, fix it. Problem comes up, fix it. What am I doing? I'm playing whack-a-mole with my problems. What if I got under the covers and found out why those moles were coming up? Be easier on the moles, be easier on me. Just don't have them. This is the big insight about Toyota systems thinking and continuous learning. So what we have is we have to go smaller. We have to get quick feedback, and we have to look deeper. This is what's called second order learning, or Art Giroux talked about it as second double loop learning. Okay, Chris, I'm not saying his last name right. Okay, I'm going to pause for questions. Does this seem okay so far? Okay. Chris Argyris. Okay, so this was what happened. They focused, you could say they focused on quality, but that's not really what they focused on. Yes, they were fixing problems, absolutely. But what they were really doing was focusing on removing delays, which caused lower quality. They could see that. They could see, and the quality we're talking about is both in the process and in the product. So there was this oh, just total focus 100% on continuously learning how to improve the process and how to improve the product. And that by doing that, quality naturally goes up. This is where a lot of people have it be backwards. You are focusing, the motivation is quality. The motivation is not making errors. But the real thing is by removing delays and going smaller batches, because smaller batches reduce delays because it's quicker to do it done. Quality naturally goes up. Now, people misunderstand this a lot because Ono left something out in the Toyota production system. Whether it's intentional or not, I'm not sure. He did say he didn't explain everything. He did acknowledge at one time that he didn't explain everything because he really didn't want to give it all away because he was afraid the United States would copy it. But some of it might have also just been an oversight. In Japan, in the 50s and 60s, the Japanese had been introduced to Deming. Now, we had been introduced to Deming too. The problem is the people who knew Deming were mostly the women in the factories that he was helping guide during World War II. And when the war ended, the women went home, you know, the men came home and they went and stopped working. And all this knowledge that the United States at one time had about how to do Deming really, really well got lost. So this question about can women be good managers? Hell, they've already demonstrated that they were better managers than the men. So let's just dispel that misogynist thought. And that's why the United States didn't know how to do it from a guy who had taught us, and then we forgot it, and then he taught it to the Japanese. And part of Deming is systems thinking, and that the errors occur to the system. So you can't just hit the mold. You got to ask, why is that mold coming up? So where time is spent creating high value, creating lower value, rework due to errors. And the idea is how do we stop spending time on lower value and rework? And people will say, limiting belief, oh, you really don't know what the customer wants. Well, actually, you may not know what the customer wants, but you shouldn't be looking for wants, turns out. I'm just going to give a reference to what Tony Olwick called jobs to be done, which is it parallels what Amplio does. I now say like we do jobs to be done because it's easier to explain it in terms of some book that's already written. But in fact, I had created it or learned it, you might say, from Fernando Flores back in the 80s, that you look to see how people work and you see what would be useful for them. You talk to them about it, of course, but they often don't see how to improve their own work. They tell you what they want and they need because they see problems. They don't get to the underlying piece. Most people aren't trained in that. So the key here is to stop rework and working on things of lesser value. That's the key. It's not about going faster. If you're going faster, I guarantee you, you're going to lose quality. That's not what you should be doing. It's not what Toyota did. So we get quick feedback. So we know we're working on the right thing. We manage our work in process, avoid delays. We achieve this by keeping workflow within capacity. By the way, keeping workflow within capacity is only one aspect of keep managing work in process. You might have a certain amount of work within your capacity, but if you don't work on it properly, you'll still get overwhelmed, you'll still multitask and all that. So you need both. How much am I letting in, and then how am I working on it to keep it smooth? Okay. In the TPS, they do talk about this, like leveling workload and things like that, but I just like to talk about it the way I mentioned it. So here's the interesting thing. Once you accept that there's another way to approach this than fixing those three, and the question is we want to look at, and I'm going to come through and show it this way. This is the way projects are always done. We might be given sufficient time. It's fixed cost, time, and budget can't be done is not accurate. Is it usually done? No, it's very rarely done. I accept it's rarely done. But rarely done and can't be done are two different things. Because if it's rarely done, you can ask the question, how can I do it more often? And if it can't be done, you accept it as a constraint. And I've seen this since I've been as a consultant now for, oh my goodness, 29 years. I've been in software for 54 years, but the first, I guess, 26 years or so, I was building software. And then since then, I've been more consulting or mentoring. And I have seen this, that people take commonplace to mean the way it is, because it's just more comfortable to do that. So if you are given enough time, you still typically see this. There's a little bit of valuable, there's less valuable stuff done. There's a lot of wasted effort, and there's a lot of good value that's not been done. So we say, oh yeah, why does it take so long? Well, it's because you're building this, and you're not focusing on this. That's why. You could actually get it done. Now, what happens if we're given not enough time? This happens too. It's not a good idea, but it happens. Well, this is what happens. Even more is not done. But you could do this, so you don't get it all, but you get more. This worry about fixed projects. The problem with fixed scope time and budget projects isn't, I think it's misguided. Sure, you shouldn't have them, but sometimes they're necessary. If you're going to say, I need to put a building up or something, you're probably going to have a contract that says when and how, and buildings are not. I'm sorry, if you study the building of buildings, they are not simple. They look simple because at the end you see it, oh yeah, that must have been how it envisioned, but it's very interesting. I've got a master's from MIT in engineering, so obviously I have some interest in engineering. Actually, it's computer science and engineering. But I've always been interested in engineering, and when I went to MIT, I'd come from a liberal arts school, Emory University, as a theoretical mathematician or studied in that. And I didn't have a lot of formal engineering, and I was kind of, what do they call it? The special, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but I was not up to the par. I was at the bottom third. Literally, they'd have you take a test on engineering. I scored at the 33rd percentile at the bottom. So they make me take remedial engineering classes. Now, remedial engineering classes at MIT are pretty hard. Let me tell you. These are like senior optics courses, electronics courses, but I got in grade. That's what I had to do. I take these courses. I did all right, but they made me really appreciate engineering. And engineering is a very important perspective on this. And when you study it and you start seeing it and you get into how things make mistakes, sometimes they're little tiny things that I was just watching something the other day where they were putting this big tower up and one little bolt failed, and that one little bolt had the whole thing come down, and 3 or 4 people were killed. That's called a nonlinear event. That's the kind of stuff you got to look for. Anyway, this is the point. Now, what happens when you're given enough time? Well, people use it. But if you have a focus on valuable, you can stop and use this for something else. It is funny. We tend to think our work is, I just got this, because construction of big projects is more complex than people give credit for. And software is less complex than people give it credit for. It's more like when we're having troubles with something that's complex, when they're having troubles with something that's incompetency. I think that's a new line. It's like the difference between a recession and a depression. When the economy goes down, it's a recession. When I lose my job, it's a depression. Okay. So what do we do here? Okay. So this is really the question. How do we get quick feedback? How do we manage our work in process? How do we keep workload within capacity? In other words, how do we become efficient? Now I have to define efficiency. Man, this word is so misunderstood and misused. I had a big conversation with Tom Gilb about this 2-3 years ago because I was doing the same. Efficiency is not how quickly you're producing something. No, efficiency is not how much you're producing. It's the ratio of value produced in a process relative to the total effort. If there's no value, you're not being efficient at all. End of story. But people don't talk about it this way. This is another problem, I think, in our industry. Nobody worries about anybody else's definitions. We make up our own, even when they're part of the language. This happens so much. Being efficient means you can achieve your results by putting the resources you have in the best way possible. That's what I call practical efficiency. When there's no value, there's no efficiency. 100% efficient means there's no waste. By the way, the only way you get to 100% efficient is by lying about it. Then you might as well go to 120%. There's always some waste. Working with no value is no efficiency. Questions on this? I know this flies in the face of a lot of definitions. I mean, a lot of people talking about it, but go back, look it up in 2 or 3 different places, and you'll see this is consistent with that. Okay, so efficiency is the first thing in the Penta. Now, I want to give caution here because this sounds like, well, it sounds like to me, maybe you wouldn't interpret it this way, but because I'm going to present the Penta in this and this and this and this and this order, it's going to sound like there's an order to it, and there isn't. Okay, I have to present it in an order. So the order I'm presenting it in is the order I think it's easier to understand, but it really works in the whole. And when you use it, which I'm not going to go into a lot, I'm going to tease it and I'll show you Tom Gilbs if you want to get into detail. Of course, Amplio uses this. So I'm going to start tying more and more back to this as a model. The thing is, you might start in any place of these 5 things I'm going to present, but I'm starting with efficiency because I think it's the easiest one to think of. And it's also what I think drove Toyota to create the Toyota production system, because they had to be quick. They had to get it done quickly. So there's not a path to follow. That's just what I'm saying. It's just easy to misconstrue that. So the question is how to become efficient. You design it in. This is why I've coined the term value by design. And we design it in, so we've got 2 things. By the way, the order of the Penta as it'll unfold has nothing to do with anything as far as I know. Either. It's just Tom drew the picture and it was like, yeah, okay. We remove delays. I mean, I've said this. This is what Toyota did. We work on smaller items. Ellie Goldratt talks about working on smaller batches is sometimes all it takes to bring a system into control. We manage our work in process. This avoids waste of multitasking. It enables us to focus. It speeds feedback. We have effective value streams. We have effective value creation structures, how we're organizing people. The list would go on and on and on. Amplio's got a whole bunch of things. Keep work below capacity. But you get the idea. These are the things in Amplio we codify as factors for effective value streams, how to be efficient.
And I think, Al, that's the tie-in to the iron triangle is it's often seen as a trade-off between efficiency and effectiveness. So
yeah,
if you're going to have higher quality, then you have to take more time in that traditional view. And I think here we're talking about value being the common thread between efficiency and effectiveness. So you wouldn't have one without the other, right?
Yes, that's correct. But I mean, actually, what you said is the common misunderstanding. So I want to deal with it a little bit. There is no trade-off between efficiency and effectiveness. If you're not effective, you're not efficient. If you're efficient, you're more effective. Yes, effectiveness is what are you doing? Are you doing the right thing? And efficiency is how well you're creating that. But if you're doing the wrong thing, you're being less efficient because you're working on the wrong thing. So we want to flip this conversation. I'm glad you said this, Casey, because that's another way. It's a nice other way of talking about the iron triangle, this trade-off that doesn't really exist. It's just that when you believe you can't work efficiently while paying attention to true value and quality, then you start making a trade-off that doesn't need to be there. This is true, by the way, in the technical world where people think you have to slow down to get high quality and remove tech debt, things like that. And the answer is no. You go faster when you design better. I've demonstrated this. I taught that my company Net Objectives taught thousands of people this, and it changed organizations when they had enough people learning this, because they would actually, turns out, upfront testing, actually it's not upfront testing. You don't test upfront. You don't have anything to test. It's deciding what to build based on what the intention is changes how you program. It goes faster, but it takes discipline, takes some knowledge. Okay, anyway, we want to increase value. This is something that's part of EVO, Tom Gilb's system. Know who your key stakeholders are and what their value success criteria and constraints are. By the way, you'll see that this is almost never discussed well in the Agile space. I don't think I even brought this into the Discipline Agile Value Stream Consultant workshop I built because I wasn't talking to Tom so much at that point. We talked about value a lot. We talked about investment pillars and all that, but not at the level he talks about. So we want to eliminate the waste and increase the value, which is what we saw just a second ago, right? Isn't that what we saw here? Decrease this, increase this. That's what we're working on. So the question now becomes, how do I do this? And we already have a lot of answers. See, this is what's really amazing. Somebody wrote this morning a post about there's no silver bullet and all that, and yet we're always chasing these silver bullets when there are all these other bullets lying around that if we just picked them up, it would be better than a silver bullet, but nobody's doing it. People want these simplistic things. He pointed out when I mentioned this, well, we shouldn't be shooting bullets anyway. And I said, you're right, we should be solving problems, the cause of the problems. But anyway, here's the thing. I'm not saying that adding resource, it's maybe worth a couple minutes to talk about resources. And by resources, I mean, you know, money, time, the people you have. I hate to lump people into that, but you know what I mean? Capabilities might be a better word, but resources include capabilities. So of people, but the point is, let's just deal with, we have what we have. Now, can we add more? Can we do a trade-off of people and time? Absolutely. Can we do a trade-off of time and budget? Absolutely, but within limits. Okay. It's funny, the mythical man month has been sold as an iconic truth, and there are two things that people don't seem to notice about it. The example he gave was if you add people at the end of a project, it doesn't work well. And the reason he gave is, and these are all true, the reason he gave is because they're not aware of what's happening. It takes time from other people, communication goes down, things like that. But what never is asked is there a way to have that not happen? And there is. This is actually another conversation. I should definitely write something on the mythical man month. The other interesting thing is it seems like nobody read to the very end of the book, because he talks about the way to create teams is to have like a 10x developer be the core and everybody else supports him. And nobody talks about this. That's how he talks about how you solve the problem. Well, maybe that, I don't think that ever would have worked, but maybe it would have, but it's not today's technology. It doesn't, I mean, it's kind of remarkable that people are using that, and 50 years later, we haven't asked the question, you know, maybe there's a way to not circumvent, but make it better. Like Kanban, and I don't mean the way the diluted Kanban you see out in the world, but the lean Kanban that a few people use, you know, people like Jim Benson, Corey Lattice, Carl Scotland, any number of people, where it's based on lean. They have, the Kanban board is not primarily about managing work in process with WIP limits on queues. That is not the primary difference between a Kanban board and an Agile board. The primary difference is a Kanban board has explicitly stated how the work is taking place on the board. It's a visual control. How's the board working? That's the biggest difference. Dave Anderson and I didn't agree about a lot of things, but we agreed on that. Now, that makes it easier for new people to come in. That's a design. That's an example of designing a board to solve your problem so you can be more efficient when people come in. But we don't do that a lot. So I'm not going to go into adding the resources. That's a separate conversation. But you get the sense of we've got resources. Okay. So here's the thing. What we want is going after maximizing value based on our critical stakeholders. This is the key. Now, who are our critical stakeholders? Well, everybody talks about users. Users are very important. What is a user? See, a user of the system could mean different things. Could it mean I'm using it? Could it mean I use the output of it? Could it mean that what other stakeholders are there that don't use it? Well, if I'm an executive who paid for it, then I'm using that product to get revenue for my company so I can use that. User is a very misleading term because most people think it's the person typing at the keyboard. They are very often the least important person. Very often, I didn't say even most of the time. Sometimes they are the critical person because if you can't get them to work, the whole system falls apart. I've been in that business too. I've been in both kinds of businesses. I've been in a kind of business where the input was so easy, anybody could do it with little training. And I've been in businesses where the person on the computer was the key person. Oh, but that makes you think too hard. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I'm not sorry. It's the way it is. I don't really wake up in the morning and say, man, I am so bummed that I can't fly without an airplane or helicopter. I've accepted that one. You know, I don't know. I don't know when I did, but it's probably when I was about 6. Um, so we have to come from this. Now, this is what's then interesting. So what's scope? Talk about scope a lot. See, we have this context of values, but scope is a reflection of the business you're in. Values are competitive attributes. Values are the competitive attributes you need, but the scope is the actual way, the actual function of manifesting your objectives based on your values. Let's think about this for a second. It's easy for me to just say that quickly, but this happened out of me thinking about this for months and then a 15-minute conversation with Tom Gill. So it's not as obvious as it might look or sound. Here's what I mean. At some point, you have to talk about what is the function that I'm actually building. Okay. How does this thing gonna look? At some other point, though, what is the objective I'm trying to meet? Those are two different things. Okay, let's ask me questions on this because this is actually a very, very key piece that actually makes the Penta very powerful. For example, the history of how the Pentagon got built where it is maybe a good one. Also, the Guggenheim Museum is a good one. And I think of the Pentagon and the Guggenheim because they were in the book, How Big Things Get Done, and he talks about both of them. And in the Pentagon, it wasn't actually just having a massive building where you can house all the US military stuff and whatever. It had a lot to do with how would people get there? How would people move around once they're in there? Okay. And the Pentagon was shaped somewhat also by the location it was in. It was just a natural shape for the building. Could have been, it wasn't like, oh, Pentagon is perfect and that's how you should build all buildings like this. No, it fit the context, which was brilliant. Okay. So there were these objectives, and then the scope became we're going to build it with 5 sides and different layers and things like that. Now, another one he talks about is the Guggenheim Museum in Balboa. I always pronounce that name wrong, I think. Brilliant building, very clear objectives. Their community was economy was going downhill, and you know, whoever runs the place, whatever you call that there, they said, we need an attraction to bring people here. That was the objective. Something that would be magnificent and actually get people to come. And I mean, obviously they thought, well, a museum would be good and all that. But now the building itself was not house art, not house sculpture. It was be so magnificent that people would want to see the building itself. It would elevate you in the presence of the art and the sculpture and all that stuff. That was the objective. Now, can you see the objective is clear? The objective is likely not going to change, but how you do it is going to change as you discover and build it. Do you see there's a difference between objective and the scope? But the scope is within the objective, which is fit by the values. Yeah, I'm going to pause, get questions or comments. Yeah. See, a statement of work is about scope. When we talk about not doing output, statement of work is like output. When we talk about, oh, we want outcomes. We want to see what it does. But it really is, what does it, how do you use it? Or what impact does it have on people? That's value. So what we want to do is shift from outputs to outcomes to meeting objectives. Now, let me say where this came from, because I fell trapped to this. It's amazing. If you say something that's wrong, even if your own experience tells you that it's wrong, and you hear it often enough, you kind of go along with it. I'm speaking from personal experience here. So I've heard all this stuff about how you can't know what you want at the beginning of the project. It's got to evolve and emerge and all this. And I thought, yeah, it makes sense. And then, Don Reinertsen talks about this too, but I think he talks about it and means it in a different way than it's interpreted. And then I don't know, it's maybe a year ago, something like that. And I kept turning at somebody. He said, but Al, you have so many projects, you knew really what to do at the beginning. I mean, almost all the time in the 80s and 90s, I developed, I can't remember, I should make a list, but at least a dozen different vertical applications. By that, I meant I used to had an application for selling used retail. I had a rent-a-nurse application. I had hair salon application. I had a public warehousing application. I had built this system with another guy. We were two tech heads who didn't know how to market. We were years ahead of the industry in what we built, and we lost money. I had a system I could build things quickly. But the point is, what I did was, when I looked at it, was no, I didn't know all the features, but I knew two things. I knew what the objective was, and I knew how to build software that could change when it needed to change. I remember a time I was displaying the appointment book system. I knew what the objective of an appointment book system was, not just for hair salons, but I'd been in the medical industry before. You take appointments and you schedule things. And I'm real proud of we had our elite customer come in, or prospect come in. We really wanted this guy. It was with the Noel Day Spa in Stamford, Connecticut, that most people haven't heard of, but his wife and he had created the Notion Day Spa. They didn't usually exist. They used to be resort spas and hair salons, and they were the first day spa in existence in the world. So he was premier. We wanted this guy. And I show him my appointments book system, and it's brilliant. And then he looks at it and he said, well, this is good, but you have stylists on the row, and I'd rather have stylists in the column. He said, surely, he did, honestly. He said, that can't be too hard to fix. And I didn't say anything. It turns out it wasn't hard to fix, because I knew to separate UI from the database. This was in the 80s. Not that many people knew this back then, but I was a good programmer and knew it. A lot of people knew it. And I did. I fixed it in an hour or two. But here's the point. The scope changed. The objective didn't change at all. And then I started realizing that, yeah, that's why I was able to do this, because I focused on the objective, not on the particulars. And I built the system so it could do this. So what we do is we tend to focus on scope and outputs. These are not always well known up front. In the Guggenheim Museum, that's what I loved about. There's a video, if you go to YouTube, and actually Google it, or search it on YouTube. There's a series of constructions. I'll put this on the notes too. The YouTube, because it's really fascinating. About 40 minutes, they talk about all these problems they had no idea how to solve. The Guggenheim's got all these wavy walls, and they want it to be open on the inside and look cool on the outside, and they didn't really know how to do that. They knew it was possible, but they figured that out. Then there were other things. How do they have a metallic surface that doesn't rust? And how does it stick together without visible welds? So they had to solve all these problems. That was all scope. They knew they could figure it out, but did they know it? No. So yeah, we want to get to outcomes, how it's functioning. But what we really want to know is, what are the objectives? What do we want to achieve? And these should be known up front. Now, here's the thing. I'm not saying you never change your objectives. I'm trying to think when I actually have. But if you do change your objectives, then you've got a new opportunity. And even if you have a statement of work, then talk to people about, hey, here's what we said we'd do. we think we can do something that'll hit your objectives better and it won't cost any more. I've actually had that happen. They usually say, love it. You mean you're going to give me more effective stuff for less money in the same time? This idea that we have to know this all, that we have to know this is a big insight. I haven't quite said this before. The fact that people think we have to know this blinds us from realizing we can know this. Why? Because we're talking about this instead of this. Questions, comments? I'm virtually done. I got one more slide. This is, I think, the easiest way to say it. The Penta helps us design our system so we can apply our resources, meaning our capabilities, time, and budget, efficiently to create as much value as we can so that we meet our business objectives. Scope may change from its original statement to deal with competitive and constraining forces consistent with the stakeholders' values, success criteria, complaints, and constraints. This should be still in line with the original objectives of the project. This is the Penta. It's a model for thinking. It's how do we create resiliency? How do we design resiliency in? I don't know if I actually stated that here, but I meant to. In other words, to eliminate delays, to eliminate waste when we discover something new. This is why I brought up complexity. We know it's going to happen. The issue with complexity is not to stop us from doing things, but to have us be aware of the fact that when something unexpected happens, we better be able to deal with it. Okay, that's it. I got 10 minutes to spare. It's amazing. When does this happen? What do you feel uncomfortable about? Or that you think you need to think about more?
Good morning.
Hi, Daniel.
I grew up with classic PMI training, of course, many years ago. And yes, I think I need to digest this thing because it's not uncomfortable, but it's making me think how actually you start not losing some kind of control, because any way you have the resources and everything, and it's of course constrained to specific restrictions by the business, by the management or something. And I am right now in struggling with some project that suddenly changed, but I realized that maybe I can take this approach. The objective of the project is the same, but we change completely the scope right now in a meeting 1 hour ago. And I realized that we will need many things to do, but I think I can start thinking in this way. The objective remains the same, I think.
So Daniel, really thank you for this, because you've given me a way to talk about this in a different way that might help give you some insights. Okay. So when scope changes, in fact, this is really nice. I mean, not your situation is nice, so that you bring it up. It's nice. When your scope changes, you should ask yourself, is the scope changing now that I have different objectives? Or not. Now, if it's changing because you have different objectives, which very often happens, by the way, it happens because we don't focus on objectives. So if the scope is changing because of objectives, then you have to ask yourself, why didn't I understand the objective? See, this is the second order thinking. What was it about how I was approaching the problems that had me not understand the objectives of my scope? And if that's the case, then I could change the way I'm doing my scope creation in the future, because I can look at what are my objectives. Now, if the scope is changing, but not due to the objectives changing, you have a different issue. Then why is scope changing within the same set of objectives causing me a problem. Now, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Excuse me. If your approach and the way you were building it was resilient enough, meaning you can make a change, like this guy, I had the columns going this way in the appointment book, and he wanted them to go this way. I mean, it took me a long time to build this appointment book, but it only took me a couple hours to fix that. Why? Because think about it, conceptually, a salon person, I mean, a stylist schedule horizontally, and then another one horizontal. It's the same information if it's column, one stylus. I just inverted the rows in the columns. So, nowadays it probably would have taken me 15 minutes, but I didn't actually know all the design patterns back then. I know now. But all I did is I went through the logic wherever I referred to rows and columns. I had good names, intention revealing names, so I could find them. So it didn't take me but an hour or two to fix the whole system, and it worked fine. But why? It wasn't luck. And it wasn't overkill. In other words, I didn't design for it to work both ways. I designed it to be able to change. So have I put resiliency into the software in this case? Have I put some resiliency into the way I'm working? So what I would suggest you do is you look at these questions. I got to make a checklist of this. It's a good way to look at it, but I never quite thought about it this way. Why is scope changing? Why is scope changing? See, when we think, oh, it's changing because we can't figure out what the scope is. Listen to the difference here. Why is scope changing? If you believe you can't know scope up front, it's, well, I overspecified, I can't possibly learn. Oh, woe is me, this is the way I'm in. This is being a victim. Unless you're really tough, oh, I'm a good developer, I'll overcome this. That's just being a martyr. It's the same thing. Instead of actually believing we can make it so scope changing isn't that big a deal. Well, that sounds crazy to a lot of people. Actually sounded crazy to me when I heard it. But it isn't the big deal if you've made it resilient and if you're still working with the same objectives. So yeah, you have to think about this, but I think hopefully you've now got some things to use to think about. Do you want to say something in addition to that? That was really a great example of what I was wanting, so thank you.
Yes, I definitely have to think it in that way. Why? The why. And of course, now I'm working in agile teams. We have like 15 teams to supervise, and this is one. And but the thing is that we can find the why. Maybe we can fix that and help for the team or other teams that can be benefited from this knowledge, because it's the first time I'm dealing with the Amplio. I am like a best Scrum master, but the classic Scrum master with some other things. But yes, I am learning about Lean, and I'm actually in the middle of the choice and finishing the reading.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So okay, thank you for the insight, and I will think about it and get back with you when I have something more clear.
Cool. Okay.
I was thinking this ties in too with the notion of learned helplessness, because we tend to think of development being sort of incremental and then having punctuated equilibrium where something big happens and then we're back to incremental, but passively, like it happens to us. And this seems like it's a way to sort of engineer that punctuated equilibrium on the front end.
Yeah.
Through learning, right? Through intentional learning cycles.
Yeah, I think the attitude is, we know we don't know everything, but we can learn what we need to know, and we can protect ourselves from what we don't know while we're learning. And that once you start really believing in Goldratt's view of inherent simplicity, that at the core there are a few principles guiding everything, then it makes a difference. There's so much that we do know that works that isn't being done, that the people complaining about how hard it is, I wish I could see how to relate to them better, or open the door, but it feels like I'm in Plato's allegory of the cave sometimes. Anyway, are there others? We're actually just about at closing time. Okay, now we or I've decided to start a new thing because I started the Scrum thing, and I'm gonna close this recording here. But let me stop the recording, but don't go away just yet, okay? Or actually, I'll say it now, maybe then somebody listens to this. So I've started a policy, you may or may not have noticed in the email, that the 30 minutes after the ACOP sessions, I'm here for Q&A. I figured if I had a session just for Q&A, maybe I'd get more questions. So let me stop the recording.